So, welcome to performance testing with JMeter session. I would like to thank all the sponsors sponsoring this event. Without them, this couldn't be really possible. For Akuya, Wunder, Platform SH, Javali, and the gold sponsors. My name is MIKAEL KUNDERT, or people call me Miksu, and I've been doing Drupal for around 9 years, working for Wunder already for 7 years, and I'm kinda talking about this topic because I'm interested in delivering big scale services, and it is important that certain important services that needs to scale, they work properly, and I've been using this tool for a while. I'm not a super expert on the area, but I am really excited and used it a lot, so that's why I'm talking about JMeter here. Quick words about Wunder. So we're doing open source UX design, and we're famous from Hugs, which means that we have a really nice culture in work. We give positive feedback only for our colleagues through virtual hugs, and we're working in 5 countries in 9 cities, and about half of our staff are employees, and we have many office dogs. So, yeah, performance. There are these different aspects in performance, and the one we are mostly going to talk about is the end user perspective. So basically how fast the service feels for the actual end user. And I would like to right away start with a topic of apahce score. And it's a really good measurement for kind of defining or using that for defining that how good your service is performing, and it's basically based on 3 zones of application responsiveness, satisfied, tolerating, and frustrated. Where satisfied means that the user is really fully productive, meaning that you're using your mobile phone and things just work quickly and you don't even notice that it's just working fast. Tolerating something that you're kind of waiting for the request. You realize that you have to wait the process you're doing. Good example, when requests are tolerating that you don't want to open the link, or if you know it takes long enough, you might open in the tab and come back to that one later. That's tolerating. And then there's a frustrated zone, which basically you could pretty much expect that the user will abandon the process they were doing. And there's kind of a scale, a T factor that you define for a project. You might have heard about the apahce score if you use New Relic. It's usually there's a dashboard for that. How many uses New Relic? Couple. That's really nice that they have the apahce score where you have the graph how it's performing. So this is really good tool. The time basically become the time when users become usually frustrated is 4 times the t-value. So if you have 1 second defined for your project's t-value, it means that after 4 seconds people become frustrated. So that's basically the background for the apahce score, and I recommend to kind of use that when you're doing performance testing and reporting. And also some projects might even specify some kind of an apahce score as a definition of done for the service. But you need to remember that in apahce score it's always subject to, or it's not relative to the amount of requests you're testing with. So apahce score is completely different with 1,000 request test than with 10 or 100,000 tests, so it's not relative to the samples. The formula is pretty simple. So basically you make a test, let's say 1,000 samples or requests, and then you count from the response times that how many satisfied responses have received, and then the tolerating ones divided by 2, and the frustrated is not calculated here. So if we test this, basically out of 100 requests, 60 are satisfied, 30 tolerating, you get the 0.75 update score, and then if you get more even, and it goes higher, then if everything is happy, then it's complete one. So then about users, when you're doing performance testing, it's ideal that the tests are kind of simulating actual realistic use scenarios. There are examples where you do performance testing and you say to the client that yes, it's performance tested and it's looking great and it handled like 100,000 requests, and then it turns out like, yeah, it's basically just getting HTTP requests to the front page with a certain amount of time, and it's like, I don't call that at all performance testing. It's maybe for testing something else, but luckily we have now really good tools and services that actually do quite pretty much good and realistic tests. So I would like to use one example case that we did. We did one project in UK, Food Standards Agency, and they're basically delivering information or like food hygiene information, like in forms of if there's some alerts around, if you remember the horse meat scandal and that kind of stuff. It's the stuff that they kind of they are the organization where people start to look up and how's the food in UK. I think like every country almost have their own organization for this. And yeah, it's a service basically where people look for that, and there's the most used, I think maybe it's the most used feature, but people go also to check that how's the food hygiene ratings for specific restaurants. And if you think or start to define a scenario for this case, you'll probably land into a front page, and then you would go and click on the Apple link food hygiene ratings, after which you could take into the search form, and then you start to type your keyword. Maybe some of the users even uses the advanced search for it, and then they get into the search results, and then they click to one of the search results and end up to the food hygiene rating page. And maybe even from here they might even, if there's a really bad rating or some cases, you might want to investigate that how it's actually evaluated. So maybe some of the users would click the links what would go to the page which explains how they are evaluated. So this is kind of like a good example of defining a good scenario that is realistic. You need to make the scenarios in a way that you make sure that when you load a page, you also load the assets, and also make variations. So not everybody does this path. So you can say that you throw up like 10,000 users to the front page, and maybe then 80% of them goes to the actual food hygiene ratings, and out of that, maybe 60% or no, maybe 70-80% of those users are just typing the keyboard and hitting enter, and then the rest of the users are using the advanced search, and you kind of make a little bit variations on the user path, how they actually are doing the tasks in the service. So before we go into the JMeter demo, I'm quickly going to mention a couple of other tools also that might be interesting to look into or worth of mentioning. So I'm mentioning the first one, which is Apache Benchmark, which is AB, and that's not recommended, but it's worth of mentioning that people use or can maybe use this and as an excuse to say that it's performance tested. So it's basically just doing requests, and it's not really realistic to use that. Other tools, there's one written in Scala, which is Gatling. It's licensed under Apache license 2.0, and though there the tests are written in Java. And then there's a interesting tool called Locust that is quite unique in on the tools that they provide actually a web user interface. So if you need to provide a service that where you need to actually start the performance test from the web UI, for instance, if you're planning some kind of SaaS service or something, that might be useful because it provides the web user interface for it. There the tests are written in Python. Then there's a Molotov, and then there's a load booster, which is a service. But the load booster is kind of interesting that doesn't simulate traffic, it simulates actions done in the page, and therefore it's usually more expensive. But if you have a web application using a lot of WebSockets, it's really not easy to do in JMeter and other tools. But in load booster, it's kind of handy because you basically simulate actions done. So basically click this and then etc. So it's I think it's using the Casper.js there. So take a look on those options also. So JMeter demo now. So first of all, you download the Apache JMeter from their website, and then you get a package, and you can basically start from the command line, and you get a graphical user interface where you can start to basically do or plan your scenarios on the graphical user interface. And basically you end up with that, and you can basically save the test scenario. You have a file of it, and you can open it afterwards with the similar command. And you can also use that graphical interface to set up a proxy, so that you can use your browser and plug that through the JMeter, so that you can actually record some tests through your browser if you want to. And then you would basically start to create a thread group, because in JMeter you can create multiple thread groups that you can start at the same time. So you might say that the thread group of that is basically just searching for food hygiene ratings, whereas the other thread group is going for the news, and then there's another small thread group which is basically maybe the editors which are doing some editing while the storm is happening all around, and then when the editor maybe clicks save, then of course the caches gets cleared and stuff. So you could create basically as many as you can, as this makes sense. And then of course you configure how many each thread group has, or how many users each thread group has, and how it behaves when there's some errors, and also how many repetitions it does. Usually I use the configuration, the loop count forever, because I want to control the test by time, not by iterations. And I usually tend to configure the action to be taken after sample error, that it will stop the thread, because I don't want to end up in a situation where I have many threads spamming the service and all of the requests are just responding error. So I want to when I run the tests, I want to basically know that how many users it can handle, and then if I get errors, it will basically drop up a thread. So basically, an example, if I have 10 users, they start to spam the service with the scenarios, and then if one of them gets an error, then it will be dropped off, and 9 users are still left, and they're looping until I basically stop the test. Then after you have configured your thread group, you start to create an HTTP request. So You can use, I don't have a demo of that, but this is just a simple way of doing, but usually you use some other component because you have, when you have multiple HTTP request elements here, you don't want to repeat all the time like, yes, this is the protocol, this is the host, so you can use actually HTTP default element for that. But to not get confused with the demo any further, we just use this. So directly specifying what's the host and the protocol and then what's the path there. You can use the most commonly used methods for the HTTP requests. And I think you can, of course, specify your O1 also if you test in some custom HTTP methods. And you also, from the advanced, you can select that does the HTTP request then after response download all the CSS files and image files, which is, of course, what we want if we want to have a realistic one. Also, you can upload files and stuff, so basically everything you need for simulating an HTTP request. And in the next demo, or in this one, I'm making a response assertion. So when I talked before about the thread groups, that how it behaves after getting an error, it will detect that based on those assertions. So you need to define that what is an error if there's one. You can also, of course, use, you can use like just the looking what's the content of the response, what's the HTTP status, or just the code, and you can see there are many other options. I usually tend to just check at least that all the requests are responding to 100. That's not always the case that I want to test. If there are some specific errors that I want to make sure that it can handle certain amount of errors maybe, then I, of course, would use different stuff or different status codes. I also sometimes are asserting that I don't get any Drupal error messages, so I can use a selector to see that, look up if there's that element, and if there's that element, I would say that the response has an error, so I would drop that off, or even specifically check what's the actual error if I'm really looking for a specific error that I definitely don't want that it happens during the performance test. Then I can do that also. And then if you have multiple HTTP requests, the point of where you actually locate that makes sense, or basically if you have it under the HTTP request, it's only checking the assertion for that one, but if you want to have one response assertion for all the HTTP requests, it will make for them for all the sibling HTTP request elements in the tree. So you can, that's the kind of way how you specify for which requests actually it's making the assertions to. And then in this example, I'm using kind of listener, where this is kind of handful for debugging and testing. So when you're performing the requests there, you probably want to make sure that they are working. So the view results tree is handy, but it's not recommended to use in actually production run. So when you run that, you will use a lot of resources of the machine that you're using. So it's not officially recommended to use in production use. But there's another listener that you use then for storing the data that's really performant during the production run. And then you can use that data afterwards to load and see the results there. And here I'm basically using an example site and updating the protocol there. It was wrong, and I'm testing that how the requests are doing, and I get like a big bunch of requests right away, like a big bomb. It's not quite realistic. Nobody tests like that. So basically, if you have what's happening here, that we have 10 users in this thread group, that are looping over the scenario, which is basically going to the front page. And when you hit play, it will just throw at 10 people at the same time, and they're just looping quickly that they're making a request. So it's not yet quite realistic. So the next step here is to actually make some thinking time. So talking about realistic, of course, when you read the front page, you probably read it for a while, think a little bit before going to the next page. In the previous scenario would be the food hygiene rating. So you can use this element in between. And now when you test, basically there are now 10 people doing at the same time the request and waiting 2 seconds, and then another 10, and then another 10. So we have still a little bit kind of problem there. One worth of mention, of course, you can use kind of random values also for the thinking time. So you can add a range of, let's say, thinking time from 2 seconds to 10 seconds, because of course there's some variation. And of course using analytics is really useful to see that how much people actually are spending time in the page before going to the next page in the scenario. So the next step basically is to configure the ramp up period. In the original one there was only 1 second. Now I'm increasing it. So it means that when you're adding ramp up period, it means that if you have 10 users, like in this case, it will like drop off the users in 20 seconds. I think in this example it was. So it's basically people are slowly coming to your service there. So that's a good way to make it even more realistic. And now it starts to look maybe a little better, that people are slowly coming, and then the amount of requests per second or minute are increasing until it hits the maximum thread user number. And those are basic examples I had there. And basically, you can do as many thread groups as you want and use a lot of those configurations and elements and variations to make pretty realistic performance tests for simulating traffic. But you probably are not going to do it only on one machine. You probably want to do it on a cluster, if you want to, of course, maintain that yourself, the testing infrastructure. There are also a lot of services that you can use. So you can basically design the test on your machine with the graphical user interface and upload that to JMeter, for instance. I think it was JMeter, which supports JMeter, and from there you can use just that and add some assets to the test that you can use also, and then basically perform it and get the result from there, because if you don't want the hassle of setting up the infrastructure, that's a good tool to use, but not in all cases. Anyway, if you want to set up your own testing infrastructure, this is usually the model you do. So basically you have your web service you're using. In this example, there's a load balancer with some nodes of nginx, varnish, and database, and php-fpms maybe. But then basically in the testing infrastructure, you have one JMeter master, which is, you can use it through the graphical user interface or with the command line. And then you have like slave nodes that you can command from the master. So you have the configuration files for that makes this possible. And I think I have once used an infrastructure where we were having 18 JMeter slave nodes, and it was pretty interesting. So basically, when you have multiple slave nodes there, when you specify this group of 1,000 users, then it means that it will multiply by the amount of nodes. So in this case, in this infrastructure, it would actually send 6,000 users to the service. And of course, when it's getting all the data back, and they are combined on the master, and then you can read the results there. So that's pretty nice. I forgot to make a demo about how it looks. You can also use elements where you can see the graph of the response times and other stuff. So there are many of the things that is useful there. So Yeah, so findings that I've found while using JMeter in performance test. It's kind of important that you do it, and you are really thankful once you start to have some findings, because you realize that, oh God, if this would happen after the launch, that would be really horrible. I have some screenshots from one performance testing I was doing, and it's kind of really obvious and nice to see that it's actually, stressing the system. I use New Relic a lot for analyzing, because then I get all the information of if there are some issues, I can see the transactions from there. And in this case, it was an infrastructure with, I think it had one database, two or three web servers, and one load balancer. And one interesting thing, if you see the third picture, which is the memory usage, you can see that when I'm running the test, it's increasing the memory usage, and after it ends, it will stay there. And I was wondering at some point, like, okay, what happens if I just continue the performance test, and will it run out of memory maybe or not? But eventually it didn't, so it remains mystery, but what would have been happened. But it kind of paid attention there, so it was nice to pinpoint that. Also, you cannot read this, the resolution isn't good. But anyway, I'm here like in the chat wondering about what's the bottleneck of the service, and come down to confirm that it was eventually the network bandwidth in the end, which is actually what we want in performance testing, because then we know that at least there's no software errors, there's no resources running out. So it's really basically about the amounts of bits that it cannot deliver. So it's then actually about just making the infrastructure better and to balance it better. So that's actually good. Some other findings that I had is that in like real use cases, that we realized that in one test that we thought that we had a lot of web servers, but actually it was not configured. It was commented out, so it's supposed to have 4 web servers, and it was actually leading only to one server. Well, if that happened in real world in production, that wouldn't be maybe a big issue. It would be just slow and no errors. But then there was like a typical one that you can face when you start to configure your Drupal environments, that you have single database server and you have multiple web servers, that you might encounter the lock issue, which means that when other instance is trying to access the data that another is still processing or something, it gets into one specific lock issue. That it was kind of really good that we faced that in the performance testing period rather than in actual production, because the error is really nice then for the users. So it was nice that we faced that in actual testing, not in production. And then also it's a pretty nice way to see how the APIs affect on your service. So if you have a service where you are dependent a lot on other APIs, external APIs that you don't have control of, it's kind of a good way to make sure that because of course your servers are responsible for responding to your users, but if there's some issues with some of the API or the integrations you have, maybe it's a good idea to prove it before to go to production to make sure that's good. Also, ideally, of course, is that you actually make another testing scenario with JMeter, of course, to actually just test directly that API, so how many requests it can actually handle. That's, of course, recommended. So, yeah, I really encourage you to try out JMeter. It's an open source tool and widely used and supported. It has really good documentation, and you can find your answers pretty easily if you go to Stack Overflow and stumble into some issues. And what else? one downside is that their website is pretty not looking good. They could improve the UI maybe, I don't know. So yeah, before the questions, we have, if you have been wondering, this box also, which ran out of memory actually, no battery, damn. So we have this voting box, so if you want to come to the booth, you can vote what you want next, because we've been bringing every day some fruits or something for sprinting, so you can vote on our booth. Today there's a vote for a cookie and crackers, but now we need to recharge the battery. So thank you. Any questions? We have, I think we have quite much of time, so I think it's 20 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes. I can also demo some live demos if you want. Yeah? Can you use the mic, please?
Thanks. So the question is short, actually. How do you play with cache? I mean, the situation when you flash your cache, right? And the first user actually generates all the necessary cache records, beans.
Yeah.
So can you speak about it?
Caching. Well, I don't know, in terms of JMeter, do you mean like in Drupal side, so the server side caching? Well, basically, it's not part of the JMeter. I don't know how it relates to JMeter, but what specifically you want to know about caching, or do you have more specific?
Let's imagine you have a varnish cache, enable it.
Yeah.
And so you flash the cache. So how quick? So the first visit to any URL generates the cache.
It will be slower,
it's already cached.
Yeah.
The first request is made to the database, etc., right? To the Drupal, etc. So how do you handle this? I mean, how to? Yeah, the second request already.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. So I think that it's kind of the thing we want to test. So it's completely okay. I mean, you hit the cache, and the first one who happens to hit the cache will be slower than the following ones coming. But it might be that the first user might be hitting that request that will generate the cache, and right away another one coming. So it's possible that you can get maybe some interesting responses there. And of course, that's what we want to test, because it's quite realistic way that it could happen, right? So of course, you want to just happen and make sure you catch if there's some issues, that there's another one generating a cache, and then the other one also is kind of should have the cached version, but it's kind of the progress, and that's the log issue I was talking about. It's got the same thing. So it's kind of, that's what you get, and that's when you realize that you have that issue, then you need to take a look a little bit of the configuration, the infrastructure and stuff. That's how we handled that. We have some specific configuration in Drupal that you can try to make it work in a specific way that you don't face into that specific issue that easily. But that's what you exactly want to test, to make sure that these things are, if it happens, you need to do it on the test, and those are the kind of findings you actually want from the test, rather than in production, right? Our infrastructures usually use like varnish, and then some kind of like a caching service. It used to be more memcache, but we're also a little bit using Redis, and those configurations are heavily tested, of course, then during these tests. So it's nice to test that, how they work actually, and you can see clear differences when not using those and just using Drupal regular caching. Even though the Drupal regular caching is way better in Drupal 8 than in 7. Any other questions or something that you want to see? I'll show you. Oh, God. I'm going to bring up at least quickly the Apache JMeter graphical user interface to, if you have some questions from that. Let me bring the window to you. So I'm going to at least show the other elements that you could use to check the response times, and then some other useful things. Let's see. Get there. So create the thread group. Then under the thread group, this is the list of listeners. So this is the one I showed you in the previous demo. That's what I use the mostly, but there's also the aggregate graph, which is showing you the graph of the response times. And then the one that I mentioned related to what's good for production use, I think it was, let me remember. I think it was simple data writer. Yeah, that's one that's recommended for just taking the results and then looking afterwards. You get a file. I think it's I don't know, can remember the extension of the file, but anyway, you can use that file, and then you can afterwards, after the test, add those things and load the file, and then it will, from that file, it will draw you the graphs and the requests from that file. And also, when you're running with a cluster, instead of starting the play here, you have separate buttons for that to initiate the test. And what else? Yeah, that's basically. If you have any more questions, thank you very much. And if you want to talk more about performance testing, I'll be around. We have a booth there, and we're gonna recharge the voting box so that you can have either cookies or crackers. Okay, thank you.